Hello, this is a quick introduction to some of the ancient sources and what citation references might mean. I wanted to walk you through a couple of examples for what kinds of references we need to account. And we'll start with looking at this, big volume here, Corpus Christianorum. This is a pretty standard series that has Latin critical editions in it. And this one is Augustine's On the Trinity. Its spine looks like this. It's a big volume. And it's got inside the paperwork here, it tells us it's in Series 50 and Series 50A, or Volume 50 and 50A are published together in one volume. We'll also have reference to the text in translation. There are a couple of good translations of Augustine out there that are readily available. The Fathers of the Church, again, this is the same text on the Trinity. This one's translated by Stephen McKenna. And it's usually easy to see on the spine. This is volume 45 of the Fathers of the Church series. We also want to have reference to the Works of St. Augustine series. This is what that looks like in hardback. The Trinity, again, we're talking about the exact same text. And the spine will tell us it's in volume 5 of series 1, or series I in Roman numerals. That information would also be listed in the standard first pages, where we've got translation by Edmund Hill, and it tells us part 1, book, volume 5. So, let's say that we want to talk about what Augustine discusses in book 2, the opening of book 2 of the Trinity. We might just summarize it on our own, right? Augustine discusses the limits of human efforts in trying to understand the Trinity. Now, we want to point our reader towards a place where that can be found. So we'll put a footnote and we'll say, look, it's in Augustine on the Trinity, book 2, preface, paragraph 1. And the idea is, whether you wanted to go back and read it in Latin from Corpus Christianorum Series Latinorum, whether you wanted to take another Latin edition, the older Patrologia Latina, whether you wanted to go to Fathers of the Church or Works of St. Augustine series, you could find Augustine discussing the limits of human efforts in trying to understand the Trinity. So that's a basic reference. If we quote Augustine, Augustine argues that, people who seek God and stretch their minds as far as human weakness is able, well, if we quote that, then we need to tell who translated. And the person who translated Augustine writing that way is Edmund Hill, and you can find that in the Works of St. Augustine, right? So here we have the very opening, people who seek God and stretch their minds as far as human weakness is able. And that is on page 97 of this book. All right, so to reference that, I need to say I've quoted from footnote 2, Augustine, on the Trinity 2, preface 1, and then I'm referencing Hill's translation in Works of St. Augustine, Series 1, Volume 5, page 97. Right? If we gave a different translation, let's say we worked with McKenna's translation, Augustine argues that when men seek after God and direct their minds to the understanding of the Trinity, according to the capacity of human weakness, well, that is actually found in a different English translation, Stephen McKenna's translation. And book 2 happens to be on page 51, where it starts. I apologize for all of my notes, but this is a version through which I've worked, right? When men seek after God and direct their minds. And that's page 51 of McKenna's translation, which is Works of CUA Press, Fathers of the Church, volume 45. And so that shows up in our footnote down here. Augustine, Trin 2, preface 1, translated McKenna in Fathers of the Church, 45, page 51. All right, let's say I had reference to the Latin. Augustine argues that human weakness, that is infirmitas, is a limiting factor in our understanding of the Trinity. Now, that's my summary of what Augustine said, but how do I know that infirmitas is the word Augustine used? Well, I looked it up in a critical edition that gives me Augustine's Latin. So let's find book 2 of De Trinitate and the preface. Here we are, and you can see Augustine speaks about through the abilities of our infirmity or through the limits of our infirmity. So, that is in Corpus Christianorum, Series Latinorum, right, CCSL, volume 50, and this is on page 80. I don't see the page 80 here, and that's because it's actually on the facing page the way they do their pagination. So if this is 81, of course this page is 80. Now, notice that this Latin also references another Latin edition that's common, Patrologia Latina 845. And so I could keep reference of that and let me know what page we're on in various different editions. That's helpful because not everyone might have this, large volume available, but Patrologia Latina is old enough that it's available online fairly readily. So I might add in my reference not just CCSL 50, 80, but I might have reference to the column number of the volume in Patrologia Latina, and I would have to look that back up to figure out the particular volume. But it would show up just like, volume 80.845 is the column number for there. All right, so we've got a couple of kinds of references. One, I'm just thinking about what Augustine says, and it doesn't matter in what language you read it. And so I just need to tell people that's an Augustine, De Trinitu, and section 1 of the preface. If I quote someone who's translating it, then I have to account for Augustine wrote it, and this is the translation at which I'm looking. And so I have two different translators here, the same passage. Again, it's the same reference, but I have to find or provide the different translator. And then if I take a look at it in the Latin, then I have to tell you where I found it in the Latin. And in this case, I have CCSL available at my desk. Now, you will often see a reference which provides information for three of those things, right? Augustine, Trin 2, Preface 1. So that's the original text. And anybody ought to be able to look that up in any language. If you're reading a French translation or German translation of the Latin or in English, that's fine. But then I might want to tell you that I am particularly referencing this English translation by McKenna and Fathers of the Church, and here's where you can find that. And if I include reference to the Latin here, this tells everyone that I have gone back and compared McKenna's translation to the Latin, and I agree with that translation. Or I've been tracking a particular term, and so I've had to have reference to the Latin to ensure that I'm reading it exactly as Augustine wrote it in the Latin. If I do not provide reference to an English translation here, if I only say Augustine, Trin 2, Preface 1, then by convention, we often assume that whoever wrote the paper, like you, referenced the Latin and you were providing your own translation. So we want to be careful to always note who's translating so that they're responsible for the work of translating. And if we also are responsible for the work of translating or comparing to ensure that it fits with our point, then we always want to keep track of the Latin. For most of our students, we deal with text in translation, and so we're really only having reference to the original and a translated reference. The General Convention works for nearly all ancient texts, whether they're in Greek or Syriac or any other language. We often keep track of three things: the original author, where that can be found in virtually any edition, and then we make note of which edition we've referenced in translation and which edition for the critical edition in the primary language we've looked at.